Chapter 5, Objective. As mentioned earlier, you'll want to establish what your overall objective is when preparing your presentation. In simple terms, always ask yourself what is it that you're trying to achieve. While this may seem a bit obvious, it's sometimes taken for granted. Are you trying to share some information with an audience? If so, it's probably more than an FYI. If it's just a simple FYI and you'd rather discuss it rather than send an email, then we probably don't even need to call those situations, quote, presentations. If you're sharing information such as an update, are you also trying to persuade? You may not be selling them per se, but are you trying to influence some type of behavior? In other words, offering an alternative insurance plan or unveiling a new business strategy that requires employees to embrace a new mindset. Alternatively, are you doing a highly interactive type of presentation that requires high audience involvement? Show and tell. Remember when you were a kid and had show and tell in school? Those were exciting and also simpler times, for sure. And I'm assuming that your kindergarten or first grade teacher didn't grill you on your objective when you came to show and tell, right? But if you really think about it, even the simple, innocent activity of show and tell can begin to teach us how we should think of presentations as adults. I'm sure you either brought something into class to discuss. Maybe it was a new doll that you were excited about. Maybe you didn't have a toy to bring, but you brought pictures from a family vacation and you told all of your cute little classmates about it. Maybe you got a new puppy, and while you couldn't bring Fido to school, you decided to tell the students why you got a dog instead of a cat, because of your allergies, etc. Anyway, the innocence of kids, coupled with show and tell and all of its unassuming objectives, can give us a pretty good starting point to think about your presentation. The 4 objectives. There are generally 4 main objectives of a presentation. Many authors will use different names, but they essentially boil down to the same 4. And they are not always fixed point. In other words, sometimes you can do a presentation that has a bit of a blend of 2 or more. For example, if you're a coach giving your players a locker room pep talk on what they need to do to win, don't necessarily assume this is a tell-sell situation, just because you're the coach and the players are your subordinates. This could be both tell-sell and consult-join, since a good coach knows that he needs the support from the players, the audience, in order to carry out the mission. Lecturing players simply isn't going to cut it. I use Al Pacino's, quote, locker room speech from Any Given Sunday to illustrate this. See Appendix B. Borrowing a page from Mary Munter and Lynn Hamilton, the objective of a presentation can be thought of as one of the following. Either tell-sell, used primarily when you want the audience to learn from you, or consult-join, used primarily when you want to learn from the audience or need buy-in. You can categorize them in many ways, such as tell, share, connect, influence. Let's map this out a little more specifically so you can get a better appreciation of what skills and attributes go with these, and hopefully you'll get a better handle on how to prepare your presentation. I have a table in the Kindle and paperback version of the book, which I'll share with you right now. In terms of the tell style, the skills would be present, simplify, summarize, interpret. And attributes for the tell style would be clarity, precision, discipline, confidence, tenacity. Skills for the connect style would be listen, question, discuss, probe, debate, provide, receive, feedback. And attributes for the connect style would be openness, candor, patience, curiosity, humility, and accessibility. Skills for the share style would be engage, collaborate, facilitate, and navigate. Attributes for the share style would be respect, trust, empathy, and self-awareness. Skills for the influence style would be propose, persuade, and lead. And lastly, attributes for the influence style would be transparency, authenticity and passion, and decisiveness. Another important issue in forming your objective is to ensure your presentation isn't too broad. We'll discuss agendas in another chapter, but as you begin to structure your presentation based on what you hope to achieve, make sure the various components are not so general that they become separate presentations in and of themselves. In other words, try not to do too much and be overly ambitious. Presentations and speeches can land you a promotion, a new job, a new account. Heck, a solid presentation speech sometimes changes the world in some way. See Nelson Mandela's speeches. However, they are specific in terms of their objective. People who understand strategy know that by staying focused, they stay relevant. Plan, but with a little flexibility. If you plan too well in advance, you may come across as too scripted and inauthentic. So avoid doing this. You don't want to be perceived as a, quote, cookie cutter or plain vanilla speaker. Plan well, but leave in a little wiggle room. It's understandable if in your line of work you mainly deliver tell-sell presentations that are generally straightforward. Add your own flair and dynamic, though, and make something that might be boring a little less boring. If you plan well but are perceived as, quote, militant about it, you'll quickly gain the reputation of being a boring and rigid presenter. We all know what happens when you grab a handful of sand too tightly. It slides through your fingers. If you hold it too loosely, it falls from the sides of your hands. Hold it just right with a little firmness, and most of the sand can stay in your hand. Level of details. The most important thing here is to make sure you don't confuse detail with simplification. To the extent you can, be sure to simplify when and where it makes sense. Simplification is universally good, since it means you're making your content easy to digest. The amount of details you provide partly has to do with your depth of knowledge of the subject. And as you hopefully guessed by now, after reading everything I said about audiences, it's also about your audience. When I took business communications during my MBA studies, the instructor mentioned that good and the best presenters have a strong command of details. That's good advice, but I've changed my opinion about that advice over the years. It doesn't necessarily mean that you need to share all of the details. Keep that in mind. Knowing the amount of details to provide can be tricky, but understanding your audience and your objectives should make this a lot less daunting. I touched on this above with the example on heart surgeons, but let's expand a little bit more. We have a tendency, especially when we're passionate about our subject, to give far too much detail than necessary. It's a natural inclination, and I think we do it for the following reasons. Reason 1. We're presenting to a group of superiors, and we feel that we're proving our value by showcasing our command of the details. Most of us, myself included, have been in this situation. Have some faith in your superiors and don't overcompensate. They themselves were once in your position, but even if they weren't, they trust you. Don't waste their time. If they need more detail, they'll ask. Number 2, we think we need to demonstrate how we reached a conclusion. This is different than connecting the dots, as I mentioned with the previous heart surgeon example. Here, we feel as though we need to justify our conclusions, approach, recommendations, etc. by offering the logic or sequence of events that got us there. You don't always need to. In business, we primarily care about results. And 3, we assume that since we care so much about the subject matter, our audience also does. This is a classic mistake. Sorry to say this, but even people who are interested in the presentation simply may not care as much about the subject as we do. I know this can be a bit disconcerting because we want people to care, but it's better that this come from me rather than being unsuccessful with your presentation and then really being upset. So how do we know what is the right amount of detail? My best advice is to think about when you should stop. In other words, consider when you've made your point to your particular audience. At what point do you no longer need to share additional information to support each major idea? Stop there. Another way to approach this is to ask yourself, at what point does the amount of detail I share stop adding value to the audience? Providing too many details can have the reverse effect of what you hoped for. I have a lot of respect for R&D people and have worked with them and other technical people throughout my career. But sometimes technical people make the mistake of offering too much detail to non-technical audiences. In those cases, it's not only that the amount of detail offered is unnecessary, but there's a good chance the audience, often merchants and marketing people, won't understand it. So be mindful of this. Think for a moment about a recent vacation you went on. You've returned and are telling your friends and coworkers about your trip. You may give certain friends more detail than coworkers, but you'll still leave out the things that have no bearing on anything, right? Having a time limit for your presentation can also help keep you guided. Here's an example. You're doing a presentation to a general audience on the four-stroke engine, commonly known as the gasoline-powered engine. A four-stroke or four-cycle engine is an internal combustion engine in which the piston completes four separate strokes while turning the crankshaft. Look at the difference between the original and condensed version. I'll just use the first stroke as opposed to all four, coming from Wikipedia. So here's the original. Intake, also known as induction or suction. This stroke of the piston begins at top dead center and ends at bottom dead center. In this stroke, the intake valve must be in the open position while the piston pulls an air-fuel mixture into the cylinder by producing vacuum pressure into the cylinder through its downward motion. The piston is moving down as air is being sucked in by the downward motion against the piston. Now here is my take on the condensed version. Again, for a general audience. Intake. This stroke of the piston begins at the top and ends at the bottom. The piston is moving down as air is being sucked in. Hopefully, you notice that in the condensed version, the nature of the information hasn't changed. I just reduced the amount of information. Another red flag that you might be offering too much detail is if your presentation's topic fundamentally changes at some point during your delivery. Literally. I once observed a presentation that had a lot of great elements to it in the beginning but quickly derailed. The topic was on immigration and the presentation started out very strong. The presentation began by discussing the crisis in Syria, but soon enough the presentation shifted from immigration to the Syrian war. It wasn't intentional, but the entire presentation changed because the presenter got wrapped up in too many details on the war.